November nights in Chicago hit differently. Icy winds slicing through the streets, making you appreciate every inch of warmth you could find. Julia's family home, nestled in the leafy suburbs, was that kind of warmth. The flickering candles, the scent of cinnamon and freshly baked bread. It was all part of their charm. But that night, the charm was an illusion. It was 2023, and things were supposed to be simpler, right? Dating apps had made finding someone easier, but Julia was a rare exception to the digital noise. We'd met at an actual bookstore, of all places. A year in, she wanted me to meet her mother, Carol, in what she called a more personal setting. If I'd known what was coming, I might have skipped the dinner altogether. I arrived around 6 p.m. The sky was already black, and the streetlights cast long shadows across the perfectly manicured lawn. Julia greeted me at the door, looking radiant in a cream sweater and jeans, her dark hair framing her face like a picture. Behind her, Carol appeared, the polar opposite. She was statuesque in a fitted green dress that clung to her figure. Her auburn hair was swept back, and her lipstick was a shade too red to be casual. "Welcome," Carol said, her smile wide but not quite warm. Her eyes lingered on me just a beat too long. Dinner started pleasantly enough. Julia's youthful energy filled the room as she told stories about her chaotic workdays and future ambitions. Carol chimed in occasionally, her remarks always measured and sharp, a hint of something unspoken in her tone. The tension became palpable when Julia mentioned a last-minute errand to grab wine. "Be right back," she said, grabbing her coat. She kissed me lightly on the cheek, oblivious to the shifting atmosphere as she walked out the door. The second the door shut, Carol's demeanor changed. She leaned back in her chair, studying me with those piercing green eyes. "You're older than most of her boyfriends," she noted, swirling her wine. "She's a dreamer, isn't she?" "I think that's one of the things I admire about her," I replied carefully. Carol smirked, rising from her chair and heading to the kitchen. "Admire? That's such a safe word. Come help me with these dishes," she said over her shoulder. I hesitated, the invitation feeling more like an order. When I joined her, she was standing by the sink, her back turned. The kitchen was dimly lit, the only sound the gentle clinking of glasses as she rinsed them. "She's young," Carol began, her voice softer now. "Too young to understand what she needs." I frowned. "I think Julia knows what she wants." Carol turned to face me, her expression unreadable. "Do you?" The question hung in the air, and before I could answer, she stepped closer. Too close. I could feel the warmth of her breath as her hand lightly grazed my arm. "You deserve a woman who knows what she wants," she whispered, her lips brushing my ear. "Carol," I began, my voice sharp. But then, in an act that caught me completely off guard, she kissed me. It wasn't just a peck. It was deliberate, filled with a hunger I didn't know existed in her. I pulled back, horrified. "What the hell are you doing?" Before she could answer, the sound of Julia's key in the door made us both freeze. Carol adjusted her dress, her expression annoyingly composed. I stood there like a deer in headlights as Julia walked into the kitchen. Her smile faded instantly. "What's going on?" she asked, her gaze bouncing between us. "Nothing," Carol said smoothly, picking up a glass of wine. "Nate was just helping me clean up." Julia's eyes lingered on me, narrowing slightly. "Right," she said, her tone laced with suspicion. She set the wine on the counter and walked out of the kitchen. I followed her into the living room, desperate to defuse whatever bomb Carol had just planted. "Julia," I started, but she held up a hand. "Don't," she said, her voice tight. "Not now." She grabbed her purse and headed for the door. "I forgot something at the store," she said flatly. "I'll be back." The door slammed behind her, leaving me alone with Carol once again. My blood boiled as I turned to her. "What was that? Why would you?" "Oh, relax," Carol said, waving a hand dismissively. "It was just a kiss. Don't tell me you've never been curious." "Curious?" I hissed. "That's your daughter we're talking about." Carol smirked. "And yet, you didn't stop me right away, did you?" The accusation hit harder than it should have. My phone buzzed in my pocket, breaking the tension. I pulled it out to see a text from Julia. "We need to talk. Alone." The knot in my stomach tightened. I stared at the screen, barely noticing when Carol stepped closer again. "She'll forgive you," she said casually, her tone almost playful. "She's young, and young people are always so quick to forgive." I couldn't respond. My head was spinning, my world collapsing in slow motion. All I knew was that this wasn't over, not by a long shot. As I stepped out into the cold night, I spotted Julia's car parked a few houses down. She wasn't at the store. She was sitting there, watching the house, watching us. Her silhouette was unmistakable. My phone buzzed again, this time with a single word, "Why?" And that was when I realized the night had only just begun. The cold November air slapped me in the face as I stepped out of Carol's house. My breath puffed in short clouds, my heart pounding harder with every step toward Julia's car. Her silhouette sat rigid in the driver's seat, her phone glowing faintly in her hands. She hadn't left for the store after all. "Julia," I said softly, tapping on the driver's side window. She rolled it down, her face unreadable. "Get in," she said. I hesitated but obeyed. The warmth inside the car did little to melt the icy tension between us. "So," she began, her voice brittle, "are you going to tell me what the hell just happened in there?" I swallowed hard. The truth felt like a loaded gun in my mouth. "It's not what you think," I said. "Then what is it?" she snapped, her eyes narrowing. Because from where I was sitting, it looked like my mother couldn't keep her hands off you. I froze. She had seen everything. My silence only stoked the fire in her eyes. "Did you kiss her back?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "No," I said quickly. "Julia, I didn't. I was blindsided." She cut me off. "Do you know how humiliating it is to sit there, thinking I'm building something real with you, only to see you and my mother like that?" I tried to explain, but every word sounded like an excuse. Julia's breathing grew uneven, and she gripped the steering wheel tightly. "I need time to think," she said finally. "Please just go." I opened the car door reluctantly, stepping back into the freezing night as she sped off. The taillights disappeared into the darkness, leaving me standing on the sidewalk, alone. I turned back toward the house, dreading the conversation waiting for me inside. Carol was at the window, a glass of wine in her hand and a smug expression on her face. The sight of her made my blood boil. I stormed inside, slamming the door behind me. "What the hell is wrong with you?" I barked. Carol raised an eyebrow, unfazed. "Oh, don't be so dramatic," she said, swirling her wine. "You're acting like I committed some unspeakable crime." "You did," I shouted. "That was your daughter." "And you," she interrupted me with a dismissive wave. "Save the morality lecture, Nate. You and I both know there's more chemistry between us than between you and her." I stared at her, dumbfounded. "You're insane," I said, backing toward the door. This was a mistake. I should have never come here tonight. As I reached for the doorknob, Carol's voice stopped me. "You might want to think twice before walking out." I turned to face her. "What's that supposed to mean?" Her smirk widened. "Let's just say I know things. Things that Julia might find interesting. Like that late-night text you sent your ex last month. The one you never told Julia about." My stomach dropped. "How do you know about that?" Carol shrugged, sipping her wine. "It doesn't matter how. The point is, I know. She had me cornered, and she knew it. I felt like a puppet, my strings in her hands." Without another word, I left, slamming the door behind me. The following days were a blur. Julia wasn't answering my calls or texts, and every time I tried to visit her apartment, she wasn't home, or didn't want to be found. I sank into a fog of regret, replaying the night over and over in my mind. By day 4, I was desperate. I drove to Julia's office downtown, parking across the street and waiting like a maniac until she emerged. She was with someone else, a guy I didn't recognize. He was tall, clean-cut, wearing a suit that screamed confidence. They were laughing. I followed them, guilt and paranoia warring inside me. They walked to a nearby cafe, settling into a booth by the window. I couldn't hear their conversation, but their body language was unmistakable. Leaning in close, arms brushing, smiles that lasted too long. My phone buzzed in my pocket, pulling me from my thoughts. It was Carol. Missing me yet? You should come by. We have unfinished business. I stared at the message, a cocktail of anger and fear bubbling inside me. As much as I wanted to ignore her, I couldn't. Carol wasn't just a threat to my relationship with Julia. She was a ticking time bomb that could destroy everything. That evening, I returned to her house. The moment she opened the door, I regretted coming. She was dressed casually in a silk blouse and jeans, her hair loose around her shoulders. She smiled as if she'd been expecting me all along. "You're predictable," she said, stepping aside to let me in. "I'm here to make one thing clear," I said, my voice firm. "Whatever game you're playing, it ends now." Carol tilted her head, feigning innocence. "Game? I'm not playing any game." "Bullshit," I snapped. "You're trying to ruin my life, and I won't let you." Her smile faltered for the first time. She set her glass of wine down and stepped closer. "You think I'm the bad guy here?" she asked, her voice low. "You think I'm the one ruining your life?" I opened my mouth to respond, but she kept going. "You kissed me back," she said, her eyes blazing. "Don't pretend you didn't feel something in that moment. I saw it in your eyes." "You're delusional," I shot back. "This whole thing is—" The sound of the doorbell cut me off. Carol froze, her eyes flicking toward the front door. "Are you expecting someone?" I asked. "No," she said, her voice tense. The doorbell rang again, louder this time. Carol hesitated before walking toward the door. She opened it slowly, and the blood drained from her face. Standing there, with the storm in her eyes, was Julia. Julia stood in the doorway like a tempest on the verge of unleashing destruction. Her sharp, narrowed eyes flicked between me and Carol, reading every unspoken word, every hidden betrayal. My heart pounded so loudly I could barely hear Carol's faltering attempt at a greeting. "Julia," Carol began, her voice uncharacteristically shaky. "This is a surprise." "A surprise?" Julia's voice was calm, but the venom beneath it was unmistakable. "Why? Because you didn't expect me to show up after what I saw the other night?" Carol opened her mouth to respond, but Julia brushed past her, stepping into the house. Her gaze locked onto mine, and for a brief moment, the pain in her eyes made it impossible to breathe. "Were you ever planning to tell me?" she asked, her voice tight. I shook my head, the weight of my silence a confession in itself. "Julia, it's not what you think." "Don't," she interrupted, raising a hand to stop me. "I've heard enough lies for a lifetime." She turned to Carol, who was watching with a mixture of defiance and unease. "And you're my mother. How could you do this to me?" Carol's mask of confidence cracked, revealing a flicker of something that almost looked like guilt. "Julia, you're being dramatic. It was a moment, nothing more." "A moment?" Julia laughed bitterly. "Is that what you call throwing yourself at my boyfriend while I was out of the house? A moment?" "Julia, I started. But she turned on me, her fury silencing whatever excuse I was about to make. "I trusted you, Nate. I thought you were different," she said, her voice breaking. "But you're just like every other guy. No worse. At least they didn't do it with my mother." The accusation hit me like a punch to the gut. "It wasn't like that," I pleaded. "She kissed me. I didn't want—" "Oh, don't act like a victim," Carol snapped, her composure returning. "You didn't exactly push me away." Julia's face twisted with disgust. "You're unbelievable," she spat. "Both of you." She turned on her heel, heading for the door. "Wait," I said, reaching for her arm. "Please, let's talk about this." She yanked her arm away. "Talk about what?" "How my mother betrayed me. How you couldn't even tell me the truth." There's nothing left to say. With that, she was gone, the door slamming shut behind her. The silence that followed was suffocating. Carol poured herself another glass of wine, her hands shaking slightly. "Well, that went well," she muttered, her voice dripping with sarcasm. "You're sick," I said, my voice trembling with anger. "You've ruined everything." Carol shrugged, but her facade was cracking. "She'll get over it," she said, though she didn't sound convinced. "No, she won't," I shot back. "And neither will I." I stormed out, desperate to clear my head. Julia was right. There was nothing left to say. The next morning, I woke up to find my phone flooded with messages. Most were from friends, some from Julia's close circle. It didn't take long to realize what had happened. Carol had gone nuclear. She posted a cryptic Facebook status late last night, one that hinted at family drama and betrayals that hurt the deepest. The comments section was a battlefield of speculation, with people jumping to conclusions faster than I could keep up. But the worst part? Julia had responded. Her comment, short but searing, read, "At least I don't stab family in the back. Some people should learn boundaries." It was open season. The private catastrophe had become a public spectacle. I spent the day alternating between pacing my apartment and drafting unsent texts to Julia. By late afternoon, I decided to see her in person. She deserved an explanation, no matter how much it hurt. When I arrived at her apartment, I hesitated before knocking. Her neighbor's door opened, and an older woman stepped out, eyeing me suspiciously. "She's not here," she said curtly. "Do you know where she went?" I asked, desperation creeping into my voice. "She left this morning," the woman replied, suitcase in hand. "Didn't say where she was going." I stood there, stunned. Julia had left. That night, Carol called me. I let it ring until it went to voicemail. She called again and again, until I finally picked up, my voice raw with exhaustion. "What do you want?" I demanded. "Julia left town," she said bluntly. "I know," I replied. "I didn't think she'd take it this far," Carol continued, her voice unsteady. "Nate, save it," I said coldly. "I don't care what you think anymore." "I'm sorry," she said after a pause. It was the first time she'd sounded genuinely remorseful. "Sorry doesn't fix this," I said. "Julia's gone, and it's because of us. I don't know if she'll ever come back." Carol sighed, the sound heavy with regret. "What do we do now?" I didn't have an answer. 3 days passed without a word from Julia. Then, just when I'd started to accept that she might never come back, I received an email from her. It was short, direct, and devastating. "I don't hate you, but I can't forgive you. I'm starting over somewhere else. Please don't try to find me." I stared at the screen, the finality of her words sinking in. Julia was gone, and the life we'd been building was gone with her. But the real twist came a week later. Carol showed up at my apartment, her face pale and her eyes filled with something I couldn't place. Fear? Regret? She handed me a manila envelope without a word. "What's this?" I asked. "Just open it," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Inside was a stack of photos of Carol, but not with me. She was with another man, a man I recognized. It was Julia's new mystery companion from the cafe. I stared at the photos, my hands trembling. They were glossy, high-resolution images of Carol and the man I had seen Julia with at the cafe. They weren't candid shots either. These were intimate. In one, they were laughing over drinks. In another, their faces were inches apart, locked in what could only be described as a lover's gaze. The last photo was the final nail in the coffin. Carol and the man standing at a hotel reception desk, their hands brushing like teenagers on a first date. "What the hell is this?" I demanded, my voice breaking with a mix of anger and disbelief. Carol stood in the doorway of my apartment, her arms crossed defensively. "It's not what it looks like," she said, but even she didn't sound convinced. "Not what it looks like?" I barked. "You're with him, the same guy Julia's been spending time with. What are you doing, Carol? Playing some kind of sick game?" She stepped inside, closing the door behind her. "Keep your voice down," she hissed, glancing at my neighbor's doors. "It's more complicated than you think." I shook my head, The room spinning. Complicated? You kissed me, destroyed my relationship with your daughter, and now you're sneaking around with her new, whatever he is. Explain to me how that's complicated. Carol hesitated, her face pale. Finally, she sank into the armchair by the window, exhaling shakily. I didn't know who he was at first, she admitted. We met at a fundraiser months ago. He told me his name was Alex, and we hit it off. Hit it off? I repeated, incredulous. You've been sleeping with him, haven't you? Her silence was answer enough. I ran a hand through my hair, trying to piece together the twisted puzzle. So, what? You just happened to hook up with the same guy who's now hanging around your daughter? How is that even possible? Carol's eyes darted away, guilt shadowing her features. I didn't know he was seeing Julia until I saw them together at that cafe, she said softly. My stomach turned. You knew they were together, and you didn't say anything? You just kept seeing him? I broke it off the day I found out, she snapped, tears brimming in her eyes. Do you think this has been easy for me? I didn't plan for any of this to happen. I laughed bitterly. You didn't plan for this? Carol, you've been playing with fire since the moment I stepped into your house. And now Julia's gone because of you. Because of us. Carol stood abruptly, her composure slipping. You think I don't know that? You think I don't feel like the worst mother in the world? But it's not just me, Nate. You're not innocent here. Her words cut deep, but she wasn't wrong. I had let myself get tangled in her web, and now we were both trapped. The next day, I made it my mission to find out more about Alex. Something about him didn't sit right. Carol claimed she'd ended things, but the photos suggested otherwise. And why had Julia been with him? I started by digging through social media, searching his name and scanning through Julia's tagged photos. Nothing came up. It was like he didn't exist. That's when I remembered the cafe. It was a small, boutique spot that probably kept regular clientele records. I decided to take a chance and visit. The cafe was bustling when I arrived, the aroma of freshly brewed coffee mixing with the hum of conversation. I approached the counter, trying to act casual. Hi, I said to the barista. I was here a few days ago with a friend, and I think I left my phone. Any chance someone turned it in? She frowned, shaking her head. Sorry, we didn't find any phones. Actually, I continued, lowering my voice. The friend I was with, I'm trying to get in touch with him. His name's Alex. Tall guy, dark hair, always wears suits. He comes in here often, right? Her expression shifted, a flicker of recognition passing across her face. Oh, you mean Chris? My heart skipped a beat. Chris. Yeah, she said, lowering her voice. He comes in all the time. Real charmer, tips well, but his name's definitely Chris. I've seen it on his credit card. Chris, not Alex. Do you know anything else about him? I asked, my pulse quickening. She hesitated, glancing over her shoulder. Look, I don't know much, but he's not exactly subtle. He's been here with a lot of women, different ones, almost every week. My stomach churned. That night, I confronted Carol with what I'd learned. His name's not Alex, I said, dropping the photos on her coffee table. It's Chris. And he's not just seeing you and Julia. He's been playing the field this whole time. Carol stared at the photos, her face going pale. I don't believe you, she said, but her voice wavered. Ask him yourself, I shot back. Or better yet, why don't we both pay him a visit and see how he explains this? She didn't respond, but her silence was enough. The next day, Carol and I found ourselves outside a sleek apartment complex downtown. She had managed to get his address from a mutual friend, someone she now realized had probably been complicit in Chris's lies. We knocked on the door, and a few moments later, it swung open. Chris stood there, looking as polished and confident as ever. His expression faltered when he saw us together. Carol, he said, forcing a smile. And Nate, right? Cut the crap, I said, stepping forward. We know who you really are, Chris. He blinked, his mask of charm slipping. I don't know what you're talking about. Oh, you don't? I said, pulling the photos from my pocket. Care to explain these? Or maybe why you've been juggling multiple women, including Carol and her daughter. For the first time, Chris looked genuinely rattled. But the bombshell came when another voice called from inside the apartment. Chris, who's at the door? A woman appeared behind him, tall, blonde, and unmistakably pregnant. Carol staggered back, her hand flying to her mouth. What the hell is going on? I demanded, my voice rising. The blonde woman looked confused, then alarmed. Chris, who are these people? Chris stammered, his usual confidence crumbling. And that was when Julia stepped out from the bedroom, her face a mixture of anger and heartbreak. Time froze as Julia stepped out of the bedroom. Her eyes landed on Carol and me, widening in disbelief before hardening into something cold and unrecognizable. The silence that followed was suffocating, broken only by the pregnant woman's confused voice. Chris, she said, stepping closer, her hand resting protectively on her belly. Who are these people? Chris, or Alex, or whoever he was, looked like a trapped animal. His charm, his calculated cool, had evaporated. It's not what it looks like, he stammered, his voice shaky. Carol was the first to speak, her voice trembling with fury. Not what it looks like, she spat, stepping forward. You're standing here with a pregnant woman in your apartment, and my daughter walks out of your bedroom. What else could it be? Julia crossed her arms, her jaw tightening. Mom, what are you even doing here? What am I doing here? Carol's voice broke as tears welled in her eyes. I'm here because this man lied to me. To you. To all of us. Julia's expression didn't soften. You're one to talk about lies. The accusation hit Carol like a slap, her anger faltering. Julia, No, Julia cut her off. You don't get to play the victim here, Mom. I saw you. I saw what you did with Nate. The room went deathly quiet. The blonde woman looked between all of us, her face a mask of dawning horror. Wait, she said slowly. Are you saying this guy's been sleeping with you, your daughter, and God knows who else? That's exactly what I'm saying, Julia said, her voice like ice. Chris raised his hands defensively. Okay, let's all just calm down, he said, trying to regain control. This isn't as bad as it seems. Not as bad as it seems? I shouted, stepping closer. You've been lying to everyone in this room. Who even are you? Chris squared his shoulders, trying to salvage whatever shred of authority he thought he had. Fine. You want the truth? I'm not the bad guy here. I never made anyone any promises. You're all just mad because you didn't know how to keep me interested. The sheer audacity of his words stunned everyone into silence. Then Carol slapped him. The crack of her palm against his cheek echoed through the apartment. You're disgusting, she hissed, her voice trembling with rage. Chris laughed bitterly, rubbing his cheek. Yeah, well, you're no saint, Carol. Or have you conveniently forgotten that you kissed him? He pointed at me, his eyes blazing with spite. Julia flinched as if the words were a physical blow. She turned to me, her eyes shining with unshed tears. Is that true? Julia, I began, reaching for her. It wasn't. Answer me. She shouted, her voice cracking. Yes, I admitted, my voice barely audible. But it wasn't what you think. I didn't want it. I tried to stop it. She stared at me for a long moment, the tears finally spilling over. You tried to stop it, she repeated bitterly. But you didn't. The blonde woman, who had been silent, suddenly burst into tears. I can't believe this, she sobbed, clutching her stomach. You told me you were committed, Chris. You said this baby was our fresh start. Chris rolled his eyes. Oh, give me a break, Melanie. You knew what this was. Her face crumpled, and she let out a guttural cry. I moved to help her, but she shook her head, stepping away. Julia turned to Chris, her voice eerily calm. You're a liar. A manipulative, selfish liar. But you know what? I'm done with you. All of you. Her words cut through me like a blade. Julia, please, no, she snapped, her eyes blazing. I can't do this anymore. I can't be around people who betray me. Mom, you've ruined any chance we had of being close. Nate, I thought you were different, but you're just another disappointment. Julia, Carol said, her voice breaking, I was wrong. I made a mistake. Please, don't let this destroy us. It already has, Julia said, her tone final. She grabbed her bag from the couch and walked toward the door. I'm leaving. Don't follow me. Don't contact me. As far as I'm concerned, I don't have a family anymore. The sound of the door slamming shut felt like the end of everything. In the aftermath, the silence was deafening. Carol sank onto the couch, her face buried in her hands. The blonde woman, Melanie, stormed out shortly after, muttering about lawyers and custody battles. Chris stood by the door, smirking as if he'd somehow won. You should go too, I said, my voice low but dangerous. He shrugged, grabbing his coat. Whatever. You people are insane anyway. When he was gone, Carol looked up at me, her face streaked with tears. I've lost her, she whispered. I've lost my daughter. I sat down across from her, my chest heavy with guilt and grief. We both have. Julia didn't come back. Not that day, not that week, not that month. True to her word, she disappeared from our lives entirely. I heard through mutual friends that she had moved to another state, started a new job, and was seeing someone new. Carol and I barely spoke after that night. The weight of what we'd done, the lives we'd shattered, was too much to bear. As for me, I live with the knowledge that I was the catalyst for it all. The night of cinnamon secrets, the betrayal that unraveled everything. Sometimes, the shortest moments can leave the longest scars.